George Orwell, born Eric Blair, developed his political consciousness rather late in life, a fact perhaps surprising given his enduring reputation. In his seminal essay, Why I Write, Orwell described himself as reluctantly political, speculating that had he been born into a more peaceful era, he might never have engaged with politics at all. The true catalyst for Orwell's political awakening arrived in 1936 and 1937 when he traveled to Spain to work as a journalist during the Spanish Civil War. Upon arrival, he made the profound decision to enlist and actively participate in the struggle against Francisco Franco's fascist forces. Orwell speculated that had he been asked his reasons, he would have simply said, to fight against fascism. If pressed further about his ultimate objective, he would have only replied, common decency. Some foundational elements of his political thinking were, however, already in place. He harbored an instinctive empathy for the working class and a deep distrust of unchecked authority. When he first arrived in Barcelona, a city that, amidst wartime, had been transformed into a worker-controlled, largely classless society, he remarked, "There was much in it I did not understand. In some ways I did not even like it, but I recognized it immediately as a state of affairs worth fighting for." Orwell was assigned to a Marxist militia group aligned with Leon Trotsky, which was, somewhat ironically, allied with a communist militia group loyal to Stalin and the Soviet Union. After months of intense fighting and forming strong bonds with his comrades in the militia, Orwell was critically wounded, shot in the throat by a sniper, an experience he famously described as very interesting. He likened it to being at the epicenter of an explosion, followed by a strangely painless shock that made him feel as though he had shriveled up to nothing. Orwell survived, and this injury meant he found himself involuntarily sidelined during a pivotal political upheaval. The communist faction, steadfastly loyal to the Soviet Union, had consolidated its influence within the Spanish government and systematically moved to eliminate its political rivals, specifically Orwell's Trotskyist group. This, of course, constituted a profound betrayal, given their shared struggle against Franco. Before long, almost everyone Orwell had come to know was either summarily executed or imprisoned. They were charged with conspiracy, among other fabricated accusations, which were then eagerly amplified and disseminated globally by segments of the left-wing press. After bravely attempting to assist his imprisoned comrades, Orwell sensed his own arrest was imminent. He swiftly fled the country, returning to England a profoundly changed man. Orwell firmly believed that the events unfolding in Spain were inextricably linked to the Soviet Union, where brutal political purges were similarly being carried out, cloaked in a veil of lies and relentless propaganda. He was equally convinced that many in the West were naively succumbing to this deception, prompting him to write, "It was of utmost importance to me that people in Western Europe should see the Soviet regime for what it really was." This conviction culminated in the publication of Animal Farm, a thinly disguised yet devastating critique of the Soviet Union. It powerfully conveyed that the USSR was far from the happy, free, and egalitarian society it purported to be. Instead, it depicted a starkly unequal reality where a dictatorial minority exploited propaganda and political terror to manipulate the masses, often against their own fundamental interests. Orwell brilliantly distilled the inherent absurdity and profound injustice of such a system into a now iconic proclamation by the farm's ruling pigs. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. He further underscored the peril of political naivete in such a society through the tragic character of Boxer, the loyal, hard-working horse who toiled himself to exhaustion for years. Once his usefulness waned, Boxer was not granted the promised retirement, but was brutally sent to the knacker's yard, slaughtered for meat and glue. Orwell's specific anxieties regarding the Soviet Union were, in fact, part of a much broader and deeper concern about the fundamental nature of truth itself and its systematic manipulation within the political sphere. He consistently drew attention to humanity's troubling propensity to distort reality, often to align with pre-existing political convictions. Reflecting on the Spanish Civil War, Orwell penned a poignant observation. "What impressed me then, and has impressed me ever since, is that atrocities are believed in or disbelieved in solely on grounds of political predilection. Everyone believes in the atrocities of the enemy and disbelieves in those of his own side, without ever bothering to examine the evidence. Orwell contended that intellectuals and the media, those who inhabit the realm of ideas, were particularly susceptible to losing touch with tangible reality. While a precise quote to this effect is often misattributed, it nonetheless accurately encapsulates his overarching perspective, and he did express similar sentiments. Critically reviewing the media coverage of the Civil War, Orwell declared, "In Spain for the first time I saw newspaper reports which did not bear any relation to the facts, not even the relationship which is implied in an ordinary lie." He continued, "I saw great battles reported where there had been no fighting and complete silence where hundreds of men had been killed. I saw troops who had fought bravely denounced as cowards and traitors, and others who had never seen a shot fired hailed as the heroes of imaginary victories. And I saw newspapers in London retailing these lies and eager intellectuals building emotional superstructures over events that had never happened. I saw in fact history being written not in terms of what happened, but of what ought to have happened according to various party lines." Orwell considered the propaganda emanating from the fascist side to be even more egregious. He concluded with a chilling thought. "This kind of thing is frightening to me because it often gives me the feeling that the very concept of objective truth is fading out of the world." Deeply concerned about the profound implications this would have for the writing of history, he stated, "I am willing to believe that history is for the most part inaccurate and biased, but what is peculiar to our own age is the abandonment of the idea that history could be truthfully written. In the past, people deliberately lied, or they unconsciously colored what they wrote, or they struggled after the truth while knowing that they must make many mistakes. But in each case they believed that the facts existed and were more or less discoverable." Orwell was convinced that the erosion of our collective agreement on the existence of a shared objective reality was a fundamental prerequisite for the rise of totalitarianism. Totalitarianism subsequently became a central preoccupation throughout Orwell's career, weaving together his critiques of fascism, Soviet communism, and the broader societal propensity for individuals to distort reality for political gain, often at the grave expense of human freedom. He powerfully described totalitarianism as the systematic suppression of individual thought and expression in favor of enforced political orthodoxy. He elucidated this further, writing, "It not only forbids you to express, even to think certain thoughts, but it dictates what you shall think. It creates an ideology for you. It tries to govern your emotional life as well as setting up a code of conduct." Within the chilling totalitarian society of 1984, the protagonist Winston Smith's individuality is so meticulously controlled that he is not even permitted to entertain a thought that deviates from the rigid orthodoxy of the ruling party. Those who dare to commit thought crime are either summarily executed or subjected to brutal re-education through torture until their minds are forcibly realigned with party doctrine. While Orwell was certainly responding to the overt spread of totalitarianism in nations like Germany, Italy, and the Soviet Union, he also discerned its more insidious proliferation within his native England, manifesting as a socially enforced, albeit unofficial, political orthodoxy. Disturbingly, many individuals participated in this system voluntarily, self-censoring their thoughts and expressions on particular subjects, and willingly conforming their beliefs to align with the dictates of their chosen political party. Orwell evocatively described such individuals as possessing gramophone minds, minds that simply played whatever record was placed upon them by external forces. In 1984, Winston Smith's wife serves as a stark portrayal of this type of person, willingly surrendering her body and mind to Big Brother's party, a process Orwell believed inherently dehumanizes individuals as they relinquish their identity, effectively becoming cogs in a machine. However, he recognized that not everyone would so readily accept imposed narratives. He argued that for totalitarian regimes to effectively control the broader populace, they would first need to dismantle any belief in objective truth, thereby fostering a schizophrenic relationship with reality that enabled citizens to accept the constantly shifting truths presented by party politics. Orwell observed, "The peculiarity of the totalitarian state is that though it controls thought, it doesn't fix it. It sets up unquestionable dogmas, and it alters them from day to day." He continued, "It needs the dogmas because it needs absolute obedience from its subjects, but it can't avoid the changes which are dictated by the needs of power politics. It declares itself infallible, and at the same time it attacks the very concept of objective truth." He discerned nascent totalitarian trends within language itself, recognizing its potential to dull truth, obscure reality, and even anesthetize the minds of its audience. This chilling concept is epitomized by Newspeak in 1984, a deliberately impoverished language designed to contract annually, thereby narrowing the very range of thought and ultimately rendering unorthodox or rebellious ideas impossible to articulate, let alone conceive. Orwell remained deeply concerned by totalitarianism's global expansion and contended that two vital safeguards existed against it. Firstly, the immutable existence of truth, regardless of attempts to deny or obscure it, and secondly, the liberal tradition of freedom and equality, which inherently guarantees the right to articulate truth, even when doing so runs counter to political pressures or renders that truth unpopular. He famously defined liberty with unwavering clarity, stating, "If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear." He was absolute in his staunch defense of liberty, asserting, "Any attack on intellectual liberty and on the concept of objective truth threatens in the long run every department of thought." He synthesized these profound ideas in a pivotal journal entry penned by Winston Smith in 1984, which declares, "Freedom is the freedom to say that 2 plus 2 make 4. If that is granted, all else follows." Despite his fervent defense of individual liberty, George Orwell was not a liberal in the conventional sense of the term. Fundamentally anti-capitalist, he firmly believed that capitalism was inherently exploitative and that the influence of money had a deeply distorting effect on truth. He noted, for instance, that writers might succumb to profit incentives, choosing to articulate what they believe their audience wished to hear, rather than daring to express what they considered to be true. Moreover, he contended that class inequality inevitably fostered disparities in political influence, rendering capitalist societies inherently flawed democracies. The social model, he argued, best upheld the principles of both freedom and equality was democratic socialism. Crucially, Orwell's vision of democratic socialism was not merely a welfarist modification of capitalism. Instead, it encompassed leveraging democratic processes to establish a new, largely classless society, featuring centralized means of production and income levels meticulously controlled to be approximately, though not precisely, equal. Orwell's unwavering support for democratic socialism, in fact, underpinned and motivated far more of his work than is commonly understood. As he articulated in a preface for Animal Farm, the book was emphatically not a condemnation of socialism itself. Rather, it sought to rigorously dissociate it from the totalitarian perversion of Soviet communism and thereby facilitate a vital revival of genuine socialist ideals. His most comprehensive and passionate argument for democratic socialism can be found in The Lion and the Unicorn, a powerful essay written in England in 1941, even as German bombers ominously flew overhead. Although he unequivocally condemned Hitler's regime as morally abhorrent, Orwell provocatively argued that the English could, paradoxically, glean certain practical lessons from its efficiency. He remarked of the English ruling class, "To understand fascism, they would have to study the theory of socialism, which would have forced them to realize that the economic system by which they lived was unjust, inefficient, and out of date." Orwell contended that Hitler's surprising military successes, achieved in part by appropriating certain aspects of socialism, had effectively physically debunked capitalism, definitively proving that a planned economy was inherently more robust than a planless one. He characterized fascism as a particular form of capitalism that selectively borrowed features from socialism to enhance its efficiency for wartime purposes. He sharply distinguished the two, stating that socialism aims for a world state of free and equal human beings, fundamentally taking equality of human rights for granted, whereas fascism did precisely the opposite. Fascism, he asserted, was rooted in the belief in inherent human inequality, exemplified in Germany's case by the dogma of German superiority. Orwell controversially argued that for England to secure victory in the war, It should transform the conflict into a revolutionary struggle, simultaneously waging war against both Germany's external threat and its own internal class inequality. Towards the conclusion of the war, Orwell openly reflected on these earlier claims, acknowledging that in some aspects he had been mistaken, yet his fundamental belief in the socialist cause remained unshaken. Summarizing his entire career in 1946, he famously declared, "The Spanish War and other events in 1936 and 37 turned the scale, and thereafter I knew where I stood. Every line of serious work that I have written since 1936 has been written, directly or indirectly, against totalitarianism and for democratic socialism." Orwell lived long enough to witness the publication of an influential critique positing that socialism itself inevitably led to totalitarianism. He responded by largely agreeing that this was indeed a potential threat, but he countered that the inherent injustices of capitalism rendered socialism a risk worth taking. In one of the final essays of his career, he passionately advocated, "A socialist United States of Europe seems to me the only worthwhile political objective today." Envisioning such a union founded upon the bedrock principles of liberty, equality, and internationalism, ideals he believed were perpetually hampered by the apathy and conservatism of people everywhere. The conclusion of World War II afforded Orwell the freedom to write more extensively beyond purely political themes, often with a delightful, playful touch. He penned an appreciative essay praising the unassuming beauty of the common toad, a subject he humorously chose precisely because, in his view, toads never get much of a boost from poets. He also wrote at length about his ideal pub, the moon underwater, meticulously detailing the 10 qualities that would render it perfect, only to confess, with a characteristic touch of melancholy, that there is no such place as the moon underwater. He did, however, concede that a real-life establishment possessed 8 of those 10 cherished attributes, lacking only draft stout and china mugs. In his more serious reflections, he delved into the nature of hedonism, contending that modern inventions such as film and radio insidiously weaken human consciousness and dulled our innate curiosity. Instead, he proposed that we should consciously strive to preserve patches of simplicity in our lives and apply a critical litmus test to all new products emerging from science and industry. Does this make me more human or less human? Yet, in Orwell's own candid assessment, it was precisely political engagement that elicited his finest work. He wrote, "Looking back through my work, I see it is invariably where I lacked a political purpose that I wrote lifeless books and was betrayed into purple passages, sentences without meaning, decorative adjectives, and humbug generally." Although no surviving film or audio recordings of George Orwell exist, it is, arguably, through the enduring power and prescience of his political writing that he will continue to be remembered and revered.